The WNBA didn't wake up one morning and lose its sponsors. There was no press release, no emergency announcement, no headline screaming collapse. What happened was quieter than that, and far more dangerous. Phones stopped ringing. Emails slowed down. Meetings that were once automatic suddenly got pushed to next quarter. Brands that were once eager to attach themselves to the future of women's basketball began using a new phrase behind closed doors. Let's wait and see. Because the league didn't just mishandle a moment. They mishandled the moment. Caitlyn Clark didn't enter the WNBA like a normal rookie. She arrived as a walking economy, a ratings machine, a cultural event that crossed sports, media, and generational lines. She brought casual fans. She brought non-basketball fans. She brought people who had never watched a single WNBA game and suddenly cared deeply. And instead of protecting that moment, instead of amplifying it, instead of building around it, the league hesitated. That hesitation sent a signal, not to fans, but to the people who actually decide where the money goes. Sponsors don't react to box scores. They react to momentum, optics, and power dynamics. And what they saw unfold around Caitlyn Clark raised a question no league ever once whispered about it. Does this organization even understand what it has? Because while fans were arguing on social media, something far more serious was happening out of public view. Executives were reassessing risk. Brand managers were reevaluating alignment. And league leadership was quietly realizing that the biggest star they'd ever had was becoming the center of a conversation they could no longer control. This isn't a story about Caitlyn Clark wanting out. It's not about betrayal. It's not about rebellion. It's about a league facing its own reflection and realizing too late that the system it built was never designed to handle a star this big. And once that realization hits, panic doesn't look loud. It looks like silence. From the moment Caitlyn Clark's name was called, the WNBA changed, whether it wanted to or not. Viewership surged. Ticket prices spiked. Arenas that had struggled to fill lower bowls were suddenly selling standing room. Merchandise flew off shelves. Broadcasts pulled in numbers the league had chased for decades. Even road games turned into events. Wherever she played, attendance followed. But here's the part people misunderstand. Caitlyn Clark wasn't just popular. She was disruptive. She disrupted the league's carefully balanced ecosystem, one built around parity, shared visibility, and collective branding. The WNBA had always promoted itself as a league first, stars second. That philosophy worked when no single player overshadowed the shield. Caitlyn shattered that balance overnight. Suddenly, one player was bigger than the messaging, bigger than the narratives, bigger than the usual gatekeepers who decide how attention gets distributed. And that kind of power doesn't just excite leagues, it scares them. Because once fans tune in for one person, control starts slipping. Every foul she absorbed became a clip. Every hard hit turned into a debate. Every no-call sparked outrage. And while some brushed it off as rookie treatment or physical play, sponsors saw something else entirely. They saw exposure. Not the good kind, the kind that forces brands to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions like, is this star being protected? Is the league steering the story? Is the environment stable enough for us to attach our brand long-term? And the answers weren't reassuring. Week after week, Caitlyn Clark was asked to carry the league's attention without receiving the league's protection. She was the headline without the armor, the draw without the shield, the centerpiece without the safeguards usually afforded to players of that magnitude. And that contradiction didn't go unnoticed. Inside league circles, there was tension. Some executives understood exactly what Caitlyn represented, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to expand the audience permanently. Others worried about the precedent. If one player becomes the sun, what happens to the rest of the system? That internal split slowed everything down. Marketing pushes felt cautious. Messaging felt muted. Opportunities that should have been automatic were suddenly debated. And in the corporate world, hesitation is a red flag. Sponsors don't like uncertainty. They don't like mixed signals. And they definitely don't like watching a league appear unsure about its own biggest asset. The result wasn't outrage. It was distance. Because while fans argued about fairness and narratives, sponsors were quietly asking whether this was a league ready to scale, or a league afraid of its own success. And that question would soon ripple far beyond the court. Because once sponsors start wondering if a league can manage its stars, they start wondering where else their money might work better. Fans watch highlights. Sponsors watch patterns. That's the disconnect most people miss when they talk about sponsor exits or brand panic. Corporations don't care about viral clips in isolation. They care about trajectories. They care about what a moment turns into over time, and whether that moment is being handled with intention or improvisation. And when Caitlyn Clark entered the WNBA, sponsors weren't just watching her. They were watching how the league reacted to her. Because to a brand, a superstar is never just a player. She's a test case, a stress test for leadership, messaging, and long-term vision. Caitlyn Clark represented a level of visibility the WNBA had never sustained before, and sponsors wanted to see one thing above all else: stability. At first, the numbers were intoxicating. Ratings spikes, sellouts, merchandise demand that dwarfed projections. On paper, this looked like the breakthrough moment sponsors had been promised for years. Internally, marketing decks started glowing. Executives smiled. The future finally felt tangible. But then the questions started. Why does the league's biggest draw look exposed night after night? Why does the conversation keep drifting toward physical targeting instead of celebration? Why does fan outrage seem louder than official messaging? To fans, this was passion. To sponsors, this was risk. Brands don't want to be attached to chaos, especially not when it feels unmanaged. And from the outside, the league's response to Caitlyn's rise felt fragmented. There was no unified tone, no clear stance, no visible effort to reframe the narrative away from conflict and toward opportunity. That vacuum matters, because when leagues don't define the story, the internet does. And the internet doesn't speak in brand-safe language. It amplifies extremes. It rewards outrage. And suddenly, a player who should have been positioned as a celebration of the sport became a lightning rod for controversy. Not because of anything she said, not because of anything she did, but because the league didn't seize control of the moment. Sponsors noticed that silence. They noticed how often Caitlyn's name trended for reasons that had nothing to do with basketball brilliance. They noticed how debates about fairness, protection, and intent kept overshadowing performance. And most importantly, they noticed how little the league seemed willing to step in and recalibrate the narrative. That's when internal brand conversations started shifting tone. Not, how do we lean into this? But, how exposed does this make us? Because from a sponsor's perspective, attaching to a star means attaching to the league's ability to manage attention responsibly. And when that ability looks uncertain, brands do what they always do. They pause. They don't cancel contracts overnight. That would make noise. Instead, they delay renewals. They reclassify budgets. They quietly move star-driven campaigns into evaluation mode. The money doesn't disappear, it waits. And waiting is a warning. What made this situation even more alarming was how unnecessary it felt. Sponsors could see the opportunity just as clearly as fans. They understood Caitlyn Clark's pull. They understood the crossover appeal. They understood that moments like this don't come around often, which made one question impossible to ignore. If the league can't confidently stand behind its biggest moment ever, what happens when the spotlight gets even brighter? Because Caitlyn Clark wasn't the endgame. She was the beginning. And sponsors could sense that leadership was reacting instead of leading. That realization didn't trigger outrage. It triggered recalibration. Budgets were reassessed. Campaigns were diversified. And some brands began exploring parallel opportunities, not as replacements, but as hedges. Just in case. Just in case the league never fully embraced what it had unleashed. And once sponsors start hedging their bets, momentum becomes fragile. Because in modern sports, belief is currency. And belief, once shaken, doesn't come back easily. And that hesitation would soon collide with another uncomfortable reality, one the league couldn't ignore any longer. Because while sponsors were watching the league hesitate, they were also watching what didn't happen next. And that absence spoke volumes. Momentum is fragile. In sports, it's not enough to have attention. You have to capture it. You have to decide deliberately and aggressively how that attention gets shaped, where it gets pointed, and what story it's telling the world. That's where things started to go wrong. Because Caitlyn Clark wasn't lacking buzz. She was drowning in it. Every game produced clips. Every road trip felt like an event. Her presence alone shifted the atmosphere in arenas that had felt routine just months earlier. And yet, the league's official response felt restrained. Not absent. Not negligent. Just noticeably cautious. To the casual fan, this was easy to miss. But to people who work in marketing, especially sports marketing, it stood out immediately. There was no aggressive campaign recalibration, no bold repositioning of league identity around the moment, no clear signal that the WNBA was ready to lean fully into the reality that one player had dramatically altered its visibility. Instead, the messaging stayed balanced, careful, almost conservative, and that restraint created a strange disconnect. On one side, organic engagement exploded. Social platforms were flooded with Caitlyn Clark content generated by fans, media outlets, and third-party pages. Clips were pulling millions of views. Conversations spilled outside traditional basketball circles. People who had never engaged with the WNBA were suddenly invested. On the other side, the league's official channels felt steady, measured, business as usual. That mismatch raised eyebrows, because leagues don't get moments like this often. When they do, the standard playbook is clear: amplify, consolidate, and own the narrative before someone else does. But here, it felt like the league was hesitating to do exactly that. Internally, this is where fear tends to creep in. Fear of overexposure, fear of backlash, fear of alienating existing players or partners, fear of being accused of favoritism. And while those concerns are understandable, they come at a cost. Because hesitation during a breakout moment sends a message, not just to fans, but to investors and sponsors watching closely. It suggests uncertainty. It suggests unresolved internal conflict. And worst of all, it suggests that leadership might not be aligned on what the moment actually represents. Sponsors noticed the freeze. They noticed that the league didn't reposition Caitlyn Clark as the clear gateway for new audiences. They noticed the absence of decisive, star-forward storytelling. And they noticed that much of the heavy lifting was being done by outside media rather than the league itself. That's not how confidence looks. From a brand's perspective, the league had something priceless in its hands, a cultural crossover moment, and seemed unsure how tightly to hold it. That uncertainty made sponsors uneasy, because star-driven growth depends on clarity. Clarity of vision, clarity of messaging, clarity of intent. Without that, brands are left guessing. And when brands guess, they pull back. Not because they've lost interest, but because they've lost certainty. The most telling part wasn't what the league said. It was what it didn't say. There was no definitive reframing of the season around Caitlyn's presence. No bold declaration of a new era. No public acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. Instead, the moment drifted. And when moments drift, others step in to shape them. The narrative around Caitlyn Clark began forming without league guidance, driven by commentators, fans, and online discourse. Some of it celebratory, some of it critical, some of it volatile, but almost all of it uncontrolled. For sponsors, that's a nightmare scenario, because brands don't invest in volatility. They invest in stories they can trust to remain consistent. And the longer the league stayed quiet, the more the story fractured. That fracture didn't kill the momentum, but it cracked it. And once a crack forms, money starts looking for exits, not loud ones, but smart ones. Because sponsors don't leave when things go wrong. They leave when they sense leadership doesn't know how to make things go right. And that realization set the stage for the most misunderstood part of this entire saga. Because the money didn't vanish. It just started moving. When people say sponsors are leaving, they imagine something dramatic. Public statements, canceled partnerships, headlines announcing exits. That's not how real money moves. Real money moves silently. What happened around the WNBA wasn't a mass exodus. It was something far more dangerous, a redistribution. Budgets didn't disappear. They were repositioned. And that distinction changes everything. Behind closed doors, marketing executives began using a different language. Instead of committing long-term dollars tied directly to league-wide initiatives, they started breaking investments into smaller, more flexible segments. Instead of league-centric campaigns, they explored star-adjacent or sport-adjacent opportunities. Not because Caitlyn Clark scared them, but because uncertainty did. From a corporate standpoint, this wasn't panic, it was risk management. The league's hesitation created an environment where brands couldn't confidently forecast how the Caitlyn Clark moment would evolve. And when forecasts become fuzzy, financial officers tighten their grip. Renewals got delayed. Expansions got tabled. Future-facing campaigns got labeled optional. That's the first stage of withdrawal. It doesn't show up in headlines. It shows up in spreadsheets. The most telling move wasn't brands pulling out, it was brands hedging. They wanted exposure to Caitlyn's audience without tying themselves too tightly to the league's broader uncertainty. So they diversified. Some shifted spend toward individual activations. Others explored parallel women's sports properties. A few quietly tested campaigns outside the WNBA ecosystem altogether. None of this was announced. None of it was framed as dissatisfaction. It was framed as strategy. But strategy speaks volumes. Because when a league is healthy and confident, brands consolidate. They go all in. They deepen partnerships. They align messaging. When a league feels unsure of itself, brands spread out. They keep options open. They protect downside. That's what happened here. And the league felt it, even if it didn't acknowledge it publicly. Internally, the tone shifted. Conversations became more cautious. Growth projections softened. The buzz was still there, but it didn't feel as solid. It felt conditional. Conditional on Caitlyn Clark continuing to perform. Conditional on the league stabilizing its messaging. Conditional on controversy not escalating. And here's the uncomfortable truth. None of those conditions should have existed. This was supposed to be the easy part. The hard work, building awareness, capturing attention, generating interest, had already been done. Caitlyn Clark delivered that on a scale no marketing department could have manufactured. All the league had to do was harness it. Instead, brands sensed hesitation and adapted accordingly. And adaptation is contagious. Once a few sponsors start shifting strategy, others take note. Not because they're copying, but because they're comparing. They start asking, what do they see that we don't? That question alone can stall momentum. Because suddenly, the narrative isn't about growth anymore. It's about caution. It's about protecting brand equity. It's about avoiding alignment with something that feels unresolved. And unresolved moments don't attract bold investment. They attract wait-and-see behavior. That's when the stakes quietly rise. Because while fans were still celebrating sold-out arenas and viral clips, the financial ecosystem underneath was becoming more fragile. Not broken, just less committed. And that fragility mattered for one reason above all else. It put pressure on leadership. Because when money stops moving confidently, accountability follows. And that pressure would soon expose a deeper issue, one that extended far beyond Caitlyn Clark, far beyond sponsorships, and straight into the heart of league governance. Because now, the problem wasn't just marketing. It was control. Adam Silver never had to say Caitlyn Clark's name for her to become his problem. Because this was never about one player. It was about what happens when a league built on control suddenly produces a star that operates outside of it. The WNBA exists in a unique space. It is technically independent, but structurally intertwined with the NBA. Financially supported, strategically guided, philosophically influenced. And for years, that relationship worked because the WNBA didn't produce a figure who could destabilize the balance. Caitlyn Clark changed that. From a governance standpoint, stars are manageable when they grow within the system. When the league molds them, markets them, and sets the terms of their visibility. That's how control is maintained. That's how messaging stays clean. But Caitlyn didn't rise that way. She arrived fully formed, with a built-in fan base, with national recognition, with leverage that existed before the league ever had a chance to define her. And that's where the anxiety started. Because once a player's influence outpaces the league's infrastructure, authority becomes delicate. Every decision feels amplified. Every misstep feels bigger. And every attempt at restraint risks backfiring. From the outside, this looked like normal growing pains. From the inside, it felt like a governance test. The NBA has dealt with transcendent stars before, but always on its own terms. Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Steph Curry. Each one emerged inside a system built to monetize and protect them. The NBA didn't hesitate. It adapted instantly. The WNBA, by contrast, hesitated. Not because it didn't recognize Caitlyn's value, but because embracing her fully meant rewriting rules that had kept the league stable. A single player becoming the central economic driver changes everything. It affects bargaining power. It affects internal politics. It affects how other players view equity. And for a league still navigating growth, that kind of imbalance is unsettling. That's the unspoken problem Adam Silver represents in this story. Not resistance, but caution. Because the moment Caitlyn Clark became bigger than the league's messaging, she became bigger than its ability to quietly manage outcomes. And leagues don't like uncertainty, especially when they're still building legitimacy. The fear wasn't that Caitlyn would leave. The fear was that she wouldn't need permission, that her influence would continue expanding regardless of league strategy, that sponsors would follow her gravity instead of official channels, that the power dynamic would shift permanently. And when that happens, centralized control weakens. For governance bodies, that's the nightmare scenario. So decisions slowed. Messaging softened. Authority leaned conservative. The instinct wasn't to suppress, it was to contain. But containment doesn't work on momentum. The more the league tried to keep everything balanced, the more unbalanced the situation became. Caitlyn's presence distorted normal operations simply by existing. Every game she played rewrote metrics. Every road appearance highlighted disparities. Every viral moment made the gap between organic demand and official response more obvious. And sponsors saw that gap clearly. They saw a league navigating fear instead of confidence. A league protecting structure instead of seizing opportunity. A league unsure whether it wanted the future that had arrived at its doorstep. That uncertainty didn't just affect marketing. It affected trust. Because when brands sense a league is uncomfortable with its own breakout star, they start questioning long-term alignment. They start asking whether leadership is prepared for scale, or whether it will resist it. And that question is deadly. Because modern sports economics don't reward restraint, they reward momentum management. Adam Silver's nightmare wasn't Caitlyn Clark becoming too big. It was the realization that the system surrounding her wasn't ready. And once that realization sets in, everything downstream starts to wobble. Sponsors hesitate. Ownership groups question strategy. Internal divisions deepen. And the spotlight only gets brighter. Because the next phase of this story wasn't happening in boardrooms. It was happening in plain sight. And other leagues were watching closely and learning exactly what not to do. While the WNBA was still debating tone, balance, and optics, other sports didn't hesitate at all. They recognized the moment immediately. Because leagues that understand growth know something simple. When attention shows up uninvited, you don't question it, you welcome it. Outside the WNBA bubble, Caitlyn Clark wasn't viewed as a problem to manage. She was viewed as an opportunity to amplify. And that difference in mindset changed everything. In other sports spaces, there was no anxiety about her being too big. No concern about her overshadowing existing stars. No hesitation about putting her front and center. Instead, there was clarity. She brings eyeballs. She brings energy. She brings new audiences. That's the entire job. What stood out most wasn't just the enthusiasm. It was the efficiency. Other leagues didn't overthink it. They didn't wait for internal alignment or committee approval. They acted. They featured her. They celebrated her. They built moments around her presence. And the results were immediate. Engagement surged. Coverage multiplied. Casual fans followed. Media attention turned positive and focused. The narrative wasn't about conflict or controversy. It was about excitement, curiosity, and inclusion. From a sponsor's perspective, this contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side, you had a league treating Caitlyn Clark like a volatile asset, valuable but risky. On the other, you had organizations treating her like what she actually was, a cultural accelerator. That difference matters. Because brands don't just care about numbers. They care about energy. They care about whether a space feels welcoming, forward-thinking, and confident. And the way other sports embraced Caitlyn sent a very clear message. This is how stars are supposed to be handled. No defensive posture. No internal fear. No muted messaging. Just alignment. And that alignment created something the WNBA was slowly losing control of: comparison. Once fans, media, and sponsors saw how smoothly other leagues integrated Caitlyn Clark into their storytelling, it reframed everything. The question shifted from, is Caitlyn disruptive? To why is the WNBA struggling to celebrate its own moment? That question spread quietly, but relentlessly. Executives noticed it. Brand managers noticed it. Ownership groups noticed it. Because nothing exposes hesitation faster than someone else doing the same thing better. Instantly. The most uncomfortable part was that these other leagues weren't doing anything revolutionary. They were just doing the obvious. They recognized attention, leaned into it, and benefited. Which made the WNBA's restraint feel less like strategy and more like insecurity. Sponsors don't like insecurity. They don't want to fight internal politics. They don't want to navigate unspoken tensions. They want clarity, confidence, and momentum they can ride. And suddenly, the WNBA wasn't the clearest path to that momentum anymore. That doesn't mean sponsors abandoned the league outright. It means they started asking different questions. Questions like, where will Caitlyn Clark's audience feel most welcomed? Where will her moments be celebrated instead of complicated? Where does growth feel natural instead of resisted? Those questions don't stay theoretical for long. They turn into pilot campaigns, test activations, exploratory conversations. And once those begin, loyalty starts thinning. Because modern sports sponsorship isn't about tradition, it's about relevance. And relevance follows confidence. The WNBA still had the biggest star in women's basketball. That hadn't changed. What changed was the perception of whether the league knew what to do with her. And that perception started spreading internally, where it hurt the most. Because now, the pressure wasn't coming from fans or media. It was coming from ownership. And behind closed doors, patience was wearing thin. Publicly, everything looked fine. The league spoke in calm, measured tones. Executives emphasized growth, long-term vision, and collective success. Press statements stayed polished. Interviews stayed diplomatic. But behind closed doors, the mood was very different. Because ownership groups don't deal in vibes, they deal in balance sheets. And the numbers tied to Caitlyn Clark told a story that was becoming impossible to ignore. Some franchises were benefiting massively from her presence. Road games sold out. Secondary markets spiked. Local broadcasts pulled record interest. Merchandise tied directly to her appearances moved at a pace the league hadn't modeled for. Other franchises? They felt left behind. And that disparity became the source of tension. Owners started asking hard questions, not about Caitlyn herself, but about strategy. If one player could tilt the league's economics this dramatically, then the existing framework wasn't designed for what was happening. That realization split rooms. On one side were owners who saw Caitlyn Clark as the clearest growth engine the league had ever produced. They wanted to lean in aggressively. More visibility, more protection, more centralization of marketing around the reality that fans were showing up for her. On the other side were owners who feared what that would mean long-term. If the league openly built around one player, what happens when she's injured? When she retires? When the next generation doesn't replicate her pull? And more importantly, what happens to parity? That debate wasn't theoretical. It was tense, because at its core, this wasn't about basketball. It was about power distribution. Who benefits? Who loses leverage? And who gets to shape the league's future? Some ownership groups worried that overemphasizing Caitlyn Clark would make the league vulnerable, too dependent on one figure. Others argued the opposite, that not embracing her fully was the real risk. That disagreement stalled decisive action. Every proposal came with resistance. Every idea sparked concern. And instead of clarity, the league drifted further into cautious compromise, the kind that satisfies no one and solves nothing. Meanwhile, sponsors were still watching. They could sense the tension even without direct access. Deals slowed. Negotiations became more complex. Language shifted from expansion to evaluation. And ownership groups felt that pressure immediately. Because when sponsorship momentum slows, franchises feel it fast. Budgets tighten. Projections get revised. Long-term plans become conservative. And suddenly, the excitement of a breakout star is replaced by anxiety about sustainability. That's when panic sets in. Not loud panic, strategic panic. Owners began quietly questioning leadership. Not publicly, but internally. Was the league moving fast enough? Was it unified? Did it understand the moment it was living in? Those questions didn't have easy answers. And Caitlyn Clark, at the center of it all, remained silent. She didn't lobby. She didn't complain. She didn't make demands. Which, paradoxically, made things worse. Because silence removes excuses. Without controversy coming from her side, the spotlight stayed where it belonged, on the league's response. Or lack of one. And inside ownership circles, another fear began to surface. What if Caitlyn didn't need the league as much as the league needed her? What if her influence continued to grow independently through media, culture, and crossover appeal, while the league struggled to keep up? That possibility unsettled people. Because leagues are built on the assumption that stars rise within them, not alongside them. When that assumption breaks, governance becomes fragile. And now, ownership groups were staring at a future where their most valuable asset might also be their least controllable variable. That's not a comfortable place to be. Especially when the spotlight isn't dimming, it's intensifying. Because the next phase of this story wasn't about owners arguing in boardrooms. It was about how Caitlyn Clark's silence started to speak louder than any statement ever could. Caitlyn Clark never demanded anything. That's the part that unsettled people the most. In an era where stars leverage moments instantly, issuing statements, pushing narratives, reshaping public opinion in real time, Caitlyn did the opposite. She played. She showed up. She answered questions politely. And then she went back to work. No cryptic posts. No public frustration. No subtle shots. Just silence. And that silence became impossible to ignore. Because when a player with her level of attention chooses not to speak, it removes the usual distractions. There's no controversy to blame. No attitude to critique. No soundbite to twist. All that's left is the environment around her. And the environment wasn't flattering. Every game she played intensified the contrast. The crowds were louder. The cameras followed her constantly. Ratings continued to climb. The demand didn't cool, it accelerated. Yet the league's posture remained cautious. To fans, Caitlyn's silence looked like professionalism. To sponsors, it looked like restraint. To ownership, it looked like leverage. Because silence, when backed by numbers, is power. She didn't need to say she was the league's biggest draw. The data said it for her. She didn't need to complain about treatment. The footage spoke on its own. She didn't need to push narratives. The audience had already chosen her. And that made leadership uncomfortable. Because silence doesn't negotiate. It doesn't warn. It doesn't compromise. It just waits. Inside league circles, that waiting felt ominous. Not because Caitlyn was plotting something, but because she didn't need to. Her presence alone continued reshaping the ecosystem without requiring permission. Sponsors noticed this too. They saw a star who didn't stir drama, yet generated massive attention. That's the ideal profile. And they saw a league that seemed unsure how to respond to that kind of clean, organic influence. That imbalance raised a quiet but powerful question. If Caitlyn Clark ever decided to redirect her energy, would the league be able to follow her, or would it be left reacting again? That's not a hypothetical brands like to entertain. Because the most dangerous stars aren't the loud ones. They're the ones who don't need noise to move markets. Every week Caitlyn stayed silent. The spotlight shifted further away from her behavior and deeper onto league decision-making. Analysts began framing discussions differently. Fans stopped arguing about hype and started questioning leadership. The conversation matured. And that maturity was brutal. Because it stripped away emotional defenses. What remained was a clear-eyed look at cause and effect. Caitlyn Clark delivered unprecedented attention. The league hesitated. Sponsors adjusted. Ownership grew tense. No villains. No conspiracies. Just consequences. That's what made the silence so heavy. It forced everyone to confront the same uncomfortable truth. This wasn't a crisis caused by rebellion or conflict. It was caused by indecision. And indecision is contagious. As long as Caitlyn didn't speak, the league couldn't hide behind reactionary narratives. There was no urgent fire to put out, just a slow-burning realization that the moment was passing faster than leadership could act. And the longer that realization lingered, the more dangerous it became. Because now, the story wasn't about whether Caitlyn Clark was happy. It was about whether the league had earned her trust. And trust, once questioned, doesn't come back easily. Especially when the next phase of the story wasn't about emotion at all. It was about reality. About what this moment actually represented, and why it was never about leaving in the first place. At some point, the narrative took a wrong turn. People started framing this like a crossroads story. As if Caitlyn Clark was weighing options. As if this was about escape, defiance, or choosing something else over the WNBA. That was never the truth. Because this moment was never about Caitlyn leaving the league. It was about whether the league knew how to stand beside her. Stars don't abandon systems when they feel valued. They don't drift when they feel protected. They don't look elsewhere when they feel understood. What they do is respond to environments, quietly, instinctively, and without announcements. Caitlyn Clark didn't need to threaten anything. She didn't need leverage plays or dramatic pivots. Her influence had already revealed the answer to the only question that mattered. Was the league evolving with her, or asking her to slow down for it? That distinction changes everything. Because what sponsors, executives, and ownership groups were reacting to wasn't the possibility of Caitlyn leaving. It was the realization that the league's framework wasn't built for acceleration. The WNBA had spent years preparing for growth. But growth on paper is different from growth in real time. When momentum hits all at once, it tests every assumption you've made about structure, messaging, and authority. And Caitlyn Clark exposed those fault lines simply by existing. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't a standoff. It wasn't a power grab. It was misalignment. A star moving at the speed of culture. A league moving at the speed of policy. And culture always wins. That's why the money moved the way it did. Not out of protest, but out of instinct. Sponsors follow alignment. They follow environments that feel ready, not just hopeful. They weren't betting against the WNBA. They were hedging against hesitation. That's the nuance people miss. The league wasn't being punished. It was being evaluated in real time, under conditions it had never faced before. And that evaluation didn't come from critics. It came from success. Because Caitlyn Clark didn't expose failure, she exposed unreadiness. And unreadiness is dangerous because it's invisible until pressure arrives. By the time leadership realized the moment required decisiveness instead of balance, the conversation had already shifted. The league wasn't being asked to recognize Caitlyn anymore. It was being asked whether it could keep up. That's a much harder question, because keeping up requires surrendering some control. It requires trusting momentum instead of regulating it. It requires accepting that stars don't just elevate leagues, they reshape them. And reshaping is uncomfortable, but unavoidable. Caitlyn Clark wasn't challenging authority. She was redefining relevance. And relevance doesn't wait for consensus. It moves where energy flows. That's why this moment didn't explode. It evolved. Quietly. Strategically. Inevitably. And now, the league finds itself standing at a threshold it didn't expect to reach so fast. One where the future isn't hypothetical anymore. It's already happening. Which brings us to the final truth of this entire situation. The nightmare was never Caitlyn Clark becoming too big. The nightmare was realizing the system around her wasn't ready for what she represents. And once that realization sets in, there's no going back to business as usual. Only forward, or out of the way. In the end, this story doesn't end with a scandal. It doesn't end with an announcement. And it doesn't end with Caitlyn Clark walking away from anything. It ends with a realization. The kind that hits slowly, then all at once. The WNBA didn't lose Caitlyn Clark. It didn't lose its fans. And it didn't suddenly lose its sponsors. What it almost lost was control of the future. Because Caitlyn Clark represents something leagues can't manufacture, regulate, or slow down. She represents cultural momentum, the kind that doesn't ask for permission and doesn't wait for approval. That's what made this moment so dangerous. Not the attention, not the money, not even the pressure. It was the exposure. Exposure of how fragile systems become when they're forced to evolve faster than planned. Exposure of how leadership reacts when balance collides with acceleration. Exposure of how a league built to grow steadily handles a moment that demands a leap. Caitlyn Clark didn't challenge the WNBA. She revealed it. She revealed how prepared it was, and where it hesitated. She revealed how quickly belief can turn into caution. She revealed how money doesn't flee chaos, it flees uncertainty. And the quiet part? The part no one wants to admit? This wasn't a collapse. It was a warning. A warning that moments like this don't come twice. That generational stars don't slow down for institutions. That relevance isn't something you protect. It's something you ride or lose. The league still has time. Still has her. Still has the attention. But time behaves differently once momentum shows up. Because Caitlyn Clark isn't the future of women's basketball. She's the present. And the leagues, brands, and leaders who understand that won't be chasing relevance anymore. They'll already be standing in it. If you want real stories about what's actually happening behind the scenes of basketball, not the press release version. If you want to understand power, money, and moments before they explode into headlines, make sure you're subscribed. Because this Caitlyn Clark story isn't over, and the next chapter is going to make this one look quiet. If you want,